I am your host, Nero Wolfe. Let's begin our journey.
I was at my desk catching up on the bank balance and wondering if Fritz had gone overboard on the saffron for the evening's risotto when the doorbell rang. Normally, a mid-afternoon ring is just someone with a package or a process server who's lost his way, but this had a certain persistence to it. I glanced at the monitor. It was a man who looked like head been ironed by someone who didn't like him very much, crisp, stiff, and slightly scorched around the edges. I went to the front door, slipped the bolt and opened. "Archie Goodwin?" he asked. He had a voice like dry leaves skittering across a sidewalk. "On a good day," I said. "And you?" "My name is Julian Vaudois. I must see Mr. Wolfe. It concerns the 1921 Montracket." I didn't move. "Mr. Wolfe is currently with the orchids. He doesn't leave them for grapes, fermented or otherwise, until 4 o'clock. If You'd like to make an appointment, it has been poisoned," Vaudois interrupted. He didn't shout. He said it with the kind of flat finality that usually means a man is either telling the truth or is a very high-grade lunatic. "And if I am not mistaken, I am currently the primary suspect in a murder that hasn't happened yet." I looked at him again. He didn't look like a murderer, but then again, neither did the guy who sold me a waterproof watch last Tuesday. I stepped back and motioned him in. Any man who could link a vintage white Burgundy to a preemptive murder charge was worth the price of a seat in the office. I showed him into the office and steered him toward the red leather chair. He sat on the edge of it, looking around the room as if he expected the bookshelves to start leaning in on him. I went to my desk, sat, and waited. At exactly 4 o'clock, the sound of the elevator announced the descent of the mountain. Nero Wolfe entered the room. He didn't glance at Vaudois. He walked to his desk, which is sized to accommodate his 1/7 of a ton, and spent a full minute adjusting the position of a blotter that hadn't moved since 1946. Only then did he settle into his custom-built chair and turn his iced-woe pieces of polished amber toward our guest. "Mr. Vaudois," I said, filling the silence. "He's here with a bottle of wine." Wolfe's mouth twitched. To anyone else, it's nothing. To me, it's the equivalent of a Victorian swoon. He hates being interrupted, but he hates the suggestion that his time is being wasted on trivialities even more. "I do not consult on oenology, sir," Wolfe said, his voice a low rumble. "If your wine has turned to vinegar, consult a chemist or your conscience." "It isn't vinegar, Mr. Wolfe," Vaudois said, leaning forward. "It's arsenic, or something very like it. I am the cellar master for the Sterling collection. 6 months ago, the centerpiece of the Estatia Jeroboam of the 21 Montraquet was moved to a private vault. This morning, I discovered the wax seal had been tampered with, a microneedle puncture, invisible to the naked eye. I drew a sample. It would have killed the owner, Arthur Sterling, by the second glass." Wolfe sat very still. He enjoys food, he enjoys drink, and he enjoys the sanctity of his own home. The idea of someone violating a masterpiece of fermentation with a needle was, to him, a personal affront. "And why?" Wolfe asked. "Are you here instead of the police?" "Because," Vaudois said, his voice trembling slightly, "I am the only one with the key to that vault, and Mr. Sterling is currently hosting a gala where that bottle is scheduled to be opened in exactly 48 hours. If I tell him, he will ruin me. If I don't, someone dies, and I will be hanged for it." Wolfe leaned back. His eyes went half shut. This is the stage where he either kicks the person out or starts the machinery. "Archie," Wolfe said without looking at me, "is the Sterling collection not the one that recently acquired the de Vigneul's library?" "The very one," I said. "High stakes, high egos, and very deep cellars." Wolfe opened his eyes and looked at Vaudois. "You have disturbed my afternoon, sir. You have brought the stench of a crime into this room before the blood has even been spilled. It is an intrusion. It is an annoyance." He paused, his fingers tracing the edge of his desk. "I shall take the case. Not to save your reputation, but because a man who would poison a 1921 Montracket is a barbarian who must be removed from civilized society. Archie, get the details, all of them." By 6 o'clock, the brownstone's atmosphere had shifted from its usual ordered tranquility to the tense, crowded air of a waiting room. Wolfe had issued his orders with the casual tyranny of a Roman emperor. I was to instruct our nervous cellar master, Vaudois, to summon his employer and the key figures of the upcoming gala to our address immediately. The bait was simple and completely fabricated. A rival collector was allegedly attempting to serve an injunction to seize the de Vignel's library, and Wolfe had been retained to preempt it. It was a lie that appealed perfectly to a billionaire's paranoia. They arrived in a cluster at 6:15. I opened the door to let the cold evening air and the Sterling entourage into the hallway. Arthur Sterling led the pack. He was an aggressively tailored man who carried himself as though he expected the floorboards to bow respectfully under his expensive Italian shoes. Behind him came Elias Thorne, Sterling's chief acquisitions agent, a tall, bony man with the restless eyes of a habitual gambler. Rounding out the trio was Clara Finch, the gala's head coordinator and Vaudois' direct subordinate, clutching a leather binder to her chest like a shield. She looked like she hadn't slept since November. I took their coats, noting that Sterling's cashmere overcoat weighed less than my morning newspaper, and ushered them into the office. Wolfe was exactly where I had left him, anchored in his custom-built chair behind his desk, his massive frame perfectly still, a bottle of beer and a glass waiting on his desk blotter. He did not stand. He did not extend a hand. He merely let his eyes, half-closed and calculating, drift over the three newcomers as they took their seats in the yellow leather chairs I had arranged. Noir, looking pale and thoroughly compromised, sat on the far edge of the group, avoiding his employer's gaze. "Mr. Wolfe," Sterling snapped, bypassing any pretense of polite introduction, "I am a very busy man, and this gala is less than 48 hours away. Vaudois tells me some phantom claimant is trying to tie up my library in litigation. I want names, and I want to know how quickly we can crush them. I do not pay for delays." Wolfe poured his beer. He did it with excruciating slowness, ensuring not a single millimeter of foam breached the rim of the glass. The silence stretched. Sterling's face began to take on the color of an overripe plum. Thorne shifted his long legs uncomfortably, his eyes darting from Wolfe to the bookshelves and finally to me, trying to gauge the room. Clara Finch just squeezed her binder tighter. "There is no injunction, Mr. Sterling," Wolfe finally said, his tone mild, almost conversational. "Your library is quite safe. The story was a necessary fiction to ensure your prompt arrival without alerting the police or the press." Sterling stood up, his small frame rigid with indignation. "You lied to get me here? Do you have any idea who I am? I will have your license for this, Wolfe." "Vaudois, you are fired. Get your coat. Sit down, sir," Wolfe commanded. It wasn't a shout, but the resonant density of his voice hit the room like a physical weight. Sterling blinked, hesitated, and slowly sank back into the yellow leather. Wolfe picked up his glass, took a deliberate swallow of beer, and set it down. "I lied to you," Wolfe continued, "because your life is currently worth considerably less than the glass you intend to drink from on Friday night. Sometime in the last 3 days, the wax seal on your prized 1921 Montraquet was pierced with a microneedle. Fatal amounts of arsenic were introduced into the wine. Had Vaudois not noticed the microscopic disturbance on the wax and tested a fractional sample, your upcoming gala would have concluded with your agonizing death in front of 300 society reporters. The effect was immediate and perfectly silent. Anger drained from Arthur Sterling's face, leaving him looking like a very old, very fragile man. Elias Thorne stopped fidgeting, jaw slack, staring at Wolfe as if the fat man had just performed a parlor trick with a live grenade. Clara Finch let out a small, strangled gasp and dropped her binder. The thud of it hitting the carpet was the only sound in the room. Wolfe let them sit in silence for a long, deliberate moment. He pressed his palms flat against his desk. "I have agreed to find the vandal who ruined this irreplaceable vintage," he said. "To do so, I will require your absolute, unvarnished cooperation. No police, no press, no secrets. If anyone wishes to leave, the door is behind you." The silence in the office was thick enough to carve with a dull knife. Arthur Sterling collapsed back into the yellow leather chair, the starch completely gone from his posture. For a man who had narrowly avoided drinking arsenic, he didn't look grateful, he looked terrified. "Who?" Sterling whispered, the boardroom bravado entirely absent. "Who would do this?" "That is precisely what we are going to determine," Wolfe said, his tone as warm as a glacier. Mr. Vaudois, you claim you possess the sole key to the private vault. Is it a physical key or an electronic contrivance? Vaudois swallowed hard. Both. A biometric scan to enter the antechamber and an antique skeleton key for the iron gate of the vault itself. Mr. Sterling insisted on the iron gate for aesthetic reasons. And where is this physical key kept? On my person, Vaudois said defensively. Always, on a chain beneath my shirt. Wolfe's eyes shifted to take Elias Thorne. An acquisitions agent had recovered his composure, his restless eyes now fixed on Vaudois with predatory calculation. Always, Mr. Vaudois? Thorne drawled. Even when you were swimming in the estate pool on Tuesday afternoon, because I distinctly remember seeing your clothes draped over a deck chair while you were doing laps. Vaudois flushed a deep, ugly red. The key was wrapped in my towel. You had no business being at the pool house, Thorne. I reside on the estate, Vaudois. I have business everywhere, Thorne shot back. Archie, Wolfe murmured. Yes, sir, I said. My notebook open. Tuesday afternoon. Thorne was near the towel. Let's bookmark that. Wolfe turned his attention to Thorne. You are Mr. Sterling's acquisitions agent, a lucrative position, I imagine. But acquisitions require capital. Has Mr. Sterling been generous recently? Thorne stiffened. My financial arrangements with Arthur are private. Nothing is private when murder is interrupted, Wolfe snapped. You are currently negotiating the purchase of a 16th century tapestry in Madrid, a purchase Mr. Sterling recently declined to fund, leaving you exposed to a significant personal deposit. If Mr. Sterling were to suddenly expire, his estate would fall into a trust, over which you happen to be a principal executor. A convenient windfall. Sterling's head snapped toward Thorne, his eyes widening. Ilias, is that true? It's an absurdity, Thorne hissed, crossing his long legs. I wouldn't kill the golden goose over a tapestry. Besides, I don't know the first thing about arsenic or microneedles. Perhaps, Wolfe conceded. His gaze drifted to Clara Finch. The gala coordinator was practically vibrating with nervous energy, her fingers obsessively tracing the edges of her leather binder. Miss Finch, Wolfe said. She jumped as if he had fired a pistol. You organized the gala. You possess the master schedule. Did your duties require you to enter the cellar? She stammered, adjusting her glasses. I had to arrange the vault lighting. Mr. Sterling wanted them on tracket, illuminated like a museum piece. The technicians were down there on Monday morning. Were you alone in the vault at any point? Clara hesitated. A fatal pause in Wolfe's office. Briefly, the technicians went to fetch a different wattage bulb. I was alone for maybe 10 minutes. Long enough, Vaudois muttered bitterly. Clara turned on him, her meekness evaporating into sudden, sharp fury. Don't you dare. You know how much I need this gala to go perfectly. If this event fails, my agency is bankrupt. Why would I poison the centerpiece of my own career? Because, Wolfe rumbled, desperation is a versatile motive. Perhaps someone offered you a sum large enough to offset that bankruptcy, someone who wished to see Mr. Sterling humiliated or dead. The four of them glared at each other, the veneer of professional courtesy entirely stripped away. In less than 20 minutes, Wolfe had taken a room full of polished high society operators and turned them into a pit of cornered animals. It was beautiful to watch. In a grim sort of way, they all had access, they all had secrets, and one of them was cold enough to punch a hole through a priceless wax seal and fill a masterpiece with poison. This is madness, Sterling declared, standing up again shakily this time. Vipers surround me. Indeed, Wolfe said, and the bite has only been delayed. You will all return to the estate. You will proceed with the preparations as if nothing has occurred. You will speak of this to no one. And what will you be doing? Thorne demanded. Wolfe closed his eyes, leaning his head against his chair. I shall be thinking. The next morning, Wolfe was up in the plant rooms communing with his 10,000 orchids, leaving me to the glamorous work of actually solving the murder that hadn't happened yet. My instructions, delivered before he stepped into the elevator at 9 o'clock, were predictably vague and entirely my problem to execute. I was to proceed to the Sterling estate in Westchester, observe the flora and fauna, and find out which of our 3 panicked suspects had a sudden, uncharacteristic interest in medical supplies, specifically hypodermic needles. Do not interrogate Archie, he had warned. Observe. A guilty mind is a restless one. I took the roadster. The Sterling estate was exactly what you'd expect from a man who buys a library just to keep someone else from reading it. It was less a house and more a fortress of aggressive landscaping and wrought iron. I parked near the sprawling multi-car garage and flashed the temporary pass Clara Finch had grudgingly messaged me. I wasn't there as a private detective officially. I was a last-minute insurance assessor, verifying the physical layout for the gala. My first stop was the pool house. If Elias Thorne was telling the truth about seeing Vaudreuil's towel, unattended on Tuesday afternoon, I wanted to see the geography for myself. The pool was an indoor-outdoor monstrosity completely enclosed in glass. I found a young guy skimming leaves who looked like he'd rather be surfing. $10 and a friendly chat confirmed that Vaudreuil did, in fact, swim every Tuesday at 2:00, but it wasn't just Thorne who had wandered. The pool boy casually mentioned a woman with glasses and a clipboard yelling at caterers near the patio at exactly the same time, Clara Finch. She had been within 50 feet of the unguarded key, not just the acquisitions agent. I scribbled that in my notebook and headed for the main house. The place was a complete madhouse of florists, caterers, and lighting crews setting up for Friday's gala. I blended in, keeping my eyes peeled for familiar faces. I found Elias Thorne in the conservatory, pacing like a caged leopard among the rare ferns. He was barking into his mobile phone in rapid, heavily accented Spanish. I don't speak the language well enough to negotiate a peace treaty, but I certainly know the words for money, tomorrow, and trust me. He hung up, running a trembling hand through his thinning hair, looking completely desperate. If Sterling didn't die and release that trust fund, Thorne was going to be left holding a very expensive bag in Madrid. Motive, firmly established and visibly weighing on him, but motive doesn't pierce a wax seal. I needed a method. I left the conservatory and drifted toward the basement levels. The door to the cellar antechamber was locked, naturally, guarded by a very bored-looking man in a cheap suit. I didn't try to get past him. Instead, I checked the service hallway that ran directly behind it. That's where I spotted Clara Finch. She wasn't organizing caterers or yelling at lighting techs. She was standing by a row of industrial trash bins near the service entrance, carefully tearing a piece of thick, glossy paper into tiny, confetti-sized pieces. When she was satisfied, she dropped them into a bin full of discarded floral foam and hurried away, her heels clicking rapidly on the concrete floor. I waited until she turned the corner, then went diving. I am not above digging through garbage for Nero Wolfe. He pays me too well to retain my dignity. I fished out the wet, sticky pieces of paper and spent 10 solid minutes on the hood of the roadster piecing them together, like a jigsaw puzzle. It was a shipping invoice. The delivery address was Clara Finch apartment in town, dated last Monday. The item description was what made my day. It wasn't a standard needle. It was a specialized, high-gauge extraction syringe, the exact kind used by fine art restorers to inject adhesive under flaking paint, or, conceivably, the kind used to pierce a vintage wax seal without shattering it. I drove back to the brownstone feeling extremely pleased with myself. I had placed Clara Finch near the stolen key, and I had her throwing away the receipt for the perfect murder weapon. It was neat, clean, and completely damning. I entered the office 10 minutes later. Wolfe was behind his desk, leaning back, his eyes closed. He was either deeply immersed in a complex mental calculation or digesting his lunch. "I have it," I announced, dropping my notebook onto my desk. Clara Finch. She had access to the key, and she bought a syringe perfectly suited for the job. Wolfe's eyes opened a fraction of an inch. "Noir, Archie, you most certainly do not have it." I looked at Wolfe, my mouth hanging open just far enough for a fly to consider a landing. I had spent 4 hours playing scavenger hunt in Westchester, survived the smell of industrial trash, and reconstructed a paper trail that pointed a neon finger at the gala coordinator. To have him dismiss it with a blink was a bit more than my ego was prepared to handle on a Wednesday afternoon. I sat down at my desk, leaned back and crossed my arms. "Fine," I said. "The invoice is a coincidence. The syringe was for her craft hobby. The fact that she was at the pool when the key was unguarded was just her love of chlorinated air. If it isn't Clara Finch, then I suppose Thorne used his telekinetic powers to move the arsenic through the cellar door. or Vaudois decided to commit career suicide for the fun of it. Pray tell, O master of the orchids, what am I missing? Wolfe didn't even have the decency to look smug. He just sighed, a sound like a bellows losing air. Archie, you are missing the fundamental nature of the intrusion. You told me the invoice was for a restoration syringe. Such an instrument is designed for precision, yes, but also for durability against viscous fluids like resin or glue. Why would a woman as meticulous and terrified as Miss Finch order such a specific item to her own home address? If she intended to commit murder, she would have acquired a standard medical disposable from a less traceable source. Furthermore, you mentioned something else, something you saw but did not observe. I waited. When Wolfe gets into one of these moods, you have to let him reel the line in at his own pace. He shifted his weight, making the oversized springs in his chair groan in protest. You told me that something in the brownstone had been disturbed, Wolfe said, his voice dropping an octave. You didn't mention it in your report, because you likely dismissed it as a whim of Fritz or your own forgetfulness. Look at the spice rack in the kitchen, Archie. Specifically, the second shelf. I got up, entered the kitchen and looked. Fritz was busy deboning a duck, but he gave me a puzzled look. I scanned the jars. We keep a very tight ship. Everything is alphabetical, glass-fronted and polished. There, between the mace and the mustard seed, was a small gap. The marjoram was missing, not empty missing. The jar itself was gone. The marjoram, I said, walking back into the office. Someone swiped a 3-ounce jar of dried leaves. Unless our killer is planning to season Sterling to death, I don't see the connection. The connection, Archie, is that our visitor yesterday did not merely bring us a problem, they brought us a scout. While you were ushering the 3 suspects into this room, one of Thema, perhaps our client himself, took the opportunity to verify a theory. They didn't want marjoram for stew. They wanted the jar because it is the exact size and shape of the reagent containers Vaudois uses in the cellar for testing acidity. It was a dry run for a swap. I sat back down, the wheels finally turning. A swap? You mean the Montrachet isn't the only thing that was tampered with? The Montrachet was the bait, Wolfe said, his eyes now fully open and sharp. The arsenic was real, but it was never intended to be consumed. It was intended to be discovered. Think Archie. If you wish to replace a truly priceless object with a counterfeit, what better way to ensure the vault is opened, the guards are distracted, and the inventory is scrutinized than by creating a life-threatening emergency? The microneedle wasn't a murder weapon, it was a distraction to keep everyone's eyes on the poison while the real theft took place. He leaned forward, his palms flat on the desk. Vaudois is not a murderer, but he is a man of glass. Thorne is a predator, but too obvious. Miss Finch is a nervous wreck. But there is a fourth element. Someone who knew the brownstone well enough to move through it undetected while you were occupied. Someone who knows that I would focus on the intellectual puzzle of a poisoning rather than the mundane reality of a heist. But who? I asked. They were all in here with us. Were they? Wolfe murmured. Go back to your notes. Who arrived last? Who left the room to compose themselves when the shock of the poison was revealed? And more importantly, Archie, called Saul Panzer. I need a man who can look into the history of the de Vignoles, Libraire, not its contents, but its previous owners. I suspect the vintage Isenti the only thing in that cellar that has turned deadly. I reached for the phone, feeling the familiar prickle at the back of my neck. The sanctity of the brownstone had been violated for a jar of herbs and a sleight of hand. Wolfe was no longer just solving a case, he was defending his territory. And when Wolfe gets territorial, someone usually ends up wishing they'd stayed in bed. I put the call through to Saul Panzer, the best freelance operative in the business, and the only man Wolfe truly trusts to be his eyes and ears when I am busy playing nursemaid to a room full of suspects. Saul doesn't look like much, usually resembling a weary, unmade bed in a catbutt. He has a memory like a steel trap and a way of fading into the woodwork that makes him worth every cent of his exorbitant fee. Wolfe gave him the instructions: dig into the de Vignoles library, focus on the transition of ownership, and find out if any incidentals had gone missing during the Sterling acquisition. By 9 o'clock that evening, Saul was in the office, nursing a glass of beer and looking thoughtful. Wolfe was back in his throne, his chin resting on his chest, a sure sign that his brain was operating at a frequency that would melt standard wiring. I sat at my desk, ready to record the harvest. Saul didn't waste time on small talk. He reported that while the books and the wine were the headlines of the Sterling purchase, there had been a smaller, private collection of correspondence and legist shadow archive of the de Vigneul's family that had supposedly been destroyed in a small fire just before the sale was finalized. Only it wasn't destroyed, Mr. Wolfe, Saul said, his voice level. I found a specialist in Jersey City who was approached 3 weeks ago by someone looking to authenticate a very specific set of 17th century diplomatic ciphers. These weren't just old letters, they were the blueprints for hidden assets across Europe that the de Vigneul's family never officially declared. If those ciphers were found, they'd be worth 10 times the value of the wine cellar. Wolfe opened one eye. And the cellar? Did your specialist provide a description? Man, Saul replied, vague, well-dressed, but with a specific nervous tic. He kept checking his watch every 30 seconds, as if he were timed by a stopwatch. I looked at my notes from the afternoon. Elias Thorne had been checking his watch throughout our entire meeting, but then again so had Arthur Sterling. Even Vaudois had looked at the clock 3 times before Wolfe had even entered the room. It was a common symptom of being around Wolfeth man. Makes you feel like your life is ticking away. Thank you, Saul, Wolfe said, which is his version of a standing ovation. Archie, pay him, and then call our guests, all of them, including those who were not invited yesterday. Tell them that the matter of the poisoned Montrachet has been resolved, but a far more serious matter regarding the de Vigneul's ciphers has arisen. We shall gather here tomorrow morning at 11. Wait a minute, I said, after Saul had tipped his cap and slipped out into the night. What more serious matter, and who else are we inviting? You said the ones who were not invited. Wolfe shifted his weight, and the chair gave its usual moan. Mr. Sterling's security chief, a man named Henderson, whom you neglected to mention, was present in the hallway yesterday, and we shall require the presence of the technician, Miss Finch mentioned, the one who changed the light bulbs in the vault. His name is irrelevant, his presence is mandatory. I stared at him. You're tightening the net. But we still don't have the missing jar of marjoram, and we don't have the ciphers. Are you planning to bluff? I never bluff, Archie. I merely rearrange the truth so that the guilty party finds it unrecognizable. The marjoram was the key. It told me that the person who entered this house was not looking for a weapon, but for a container. They needed something that could pass a cursory inspection by Vaudois, something that looked like his own equipment. They did not poison wine to kill Sterling. They poisoned it so Vaudois would be forced to discover it, thereby creating a reason to drain the bottle or move it, allowing the thief to swap the liquid for something harmless while they made off with the real prize hidden within the Jeroboam's custom housing. The housing? I asked. You mean the wooden crate? Exactly. The de Vigneul's ciphers were never in a file or a desk. They were used as the packing insulation for the 21 Montrachet, hidden in plain sight for decades. Our thief knew this. They introduced the arsenic to ensure the crate would be opened under duress, allowing them to help in the confusion and pocket the documents. The needle was a prop, the poison was a flare, and the marjoram jar? That was to hold the arsenic they drew back out once the distraction had served its purpose. I whistled. It was a hell of a plan. Strategic, cold, and intellectually precise. It was exactly the kind of move Wolfe would appreciate if it weren't being used against his own client and his own spice rack. Get some sleep, Archie, Wolfe said, closing both eyes. Tomorrow we shall decant a murderer. The office felt like a pressurized chamber by 11 the next morning. I had the air conditioning humming, but it didn't do much to cool the tempers of the people squeezed into the leather chairs. Arthur Sterling looked like head aged a decade, his hands trembling as they gripped the arms of his chair. Elias Thorne was checking his watch with a rhythmic, obsessive frequency that made me want to grab his wrist. Clara Finch was as pale as a ghost, and Vaudois sat in the corner, his eyes fixed on his own shoes as if they held the secrets of the universe. The new additions Henderson, the beefy security chief with a neck like a fire hydrant, and a lanky lighting technician named Miller looked like they'd rather be anywhere else on earth. Wolfe entered with his usual elephantine grace. He didn't look at his guests, he looked at his desk, ensuring that his beer, his glass, and his notepad were exactly where they belonged. He settled into the chair, and the room went silent. It wasn't the silence of respect, it was the silence of a group of people waiting for a bomb to go off. Wolfe let it hang there for a full minute, his eyes drifting across the faces of the gathered suspects with the detached curiosity of a biologist examining a particularly dull tray of beetles. "We are here," Wolfe began, his voice a low, resonant boom, "to discuss a crime of remarkable elegance and staggering stupidity. A man who poisons a vintage wine to kill an enemy is a ruffian. A man who poisons a vintage wine to create a distraction for a theft is a strategist. However, a man who enters my house and steals from my kitchen to facilitate that theft is a fool. He has made the mistake of making his crime personal to me." "Mr. Wolfe," Sterling croaked, "the ciphers." "Vaudois told me what you said on the phone. Are you saying the Montrachet was never the point?" "Correct, Mr. Sterling. The Montrachet was the stage. The arsenic was the prop. The real prize was the Davignol's shadow archive hidden within the very crate that housed your wine. Our thief knew that once the poison was discovered, the cellar would become a place of chaos. Experts would be summoned, the bottle would be moved, and the packaging would be discarded or left unguarded. In that confusion, the cipher-thin sheets of vellum hidden in the linen could be extracted with ease." Wolfe turned his gaze toward the lighting technician, Miller, who suddenly looked very small in his chair. "Mr. Miller, you were in the vault on Monday. You changed the bulbs. You are also a very talented amateur restorer of antique books, a hobby that requires a great deal of specialized equipment. Equipment like micro-needles and extraction syringes." "I didn't do anything," Miller shouted, his voice cracking. "Miss Finch told me to be there." "Indeed she did," Wolfe said smoothly. "And you provided her with the invoice for the syringe Archie found in the trash, a clever bit of misdirection, intended to frame her, should the needle be discovered. But you are no strategist, Mr. Miller. You are merely the hands. You needed someone with the authority to ensure you were left alone in that vault. Someone who knew exactly what was hidden in that crate." Wolfe's eyes shifted to Henderson, the security chief. Henderson didn't flinch. He just stared back with cold, dead eyes. "You have a very impressive record, Mr. Henderson. 12 years in corporate security. But you also have a brother who works for a rival auction houser house that would pay a king's ransom for the Davignol's ciphers." "You're reaching, Wolfe," Henderson said, his voice a gravelly rasp. "I was in the hallway during your meeting yesterday. I never entered this office." "You didn't have to," Wolfe replied. "While Archie was preoccupied with the others, you used the service entrance. You knew the layout from the security blueprints you studied before arriving. You went to the kitchen, intending to find a container to transport the arsenic you had planned to recover from the bottle to prove your efficiency. You took a jar of marjoram. It was a small, quiet theft. But when you returned to the cellar last night to finalize the swap, you realized something. You realized that Archie had been watching the estate too closely." Wolfe leaned forward. "You have the ciphers, Mr. Henderson. They are currently in the lining of your jacket, and the jar of marjoram. It is in your pocket, still smelling faintly of the arsenic you drew from the Montrachet to hide the evidence of your distraction. Archie, if you would be so kind as to relieve Mr. Henderson of his burden." Henderson stood up, his hand moving toward his belt, but he stopped. He looked at me, then at the massive, immovable presence of Nero Wolfe, and then at the door. He knew he was beaten, not by force, but by a man who had seen a missing spice jar and reconstructed a conspiracy. He slowly reached into his inner pocket and tossed a bundle of vellum onto Wolfe's desk. Next to it, he placed a small glass jar of dried green leaves. "It was a good plan," Henderson muttered. "It was an adequate plan," Wolfe corrected, his eyes closing, "until you touched my spice rack." The office cleared out with the frantic energy of a sinking ship finally hitting the ocean floor. Arthur Sterling had left with his vellum ciphers clutched to his chest like a rediscovered child, though he hadn't even stopped to thank Vaudois for the sharp eyes that had saved his life. Inspector Kramer's boys were currently escorting Henderson to the local precinct, looking less like a master strategist and more like a man who had tried to outrun a glacier and failed. The silence that followed was the kind of silence that costs a client several $1,000s an hour, heavy, expensive, and perfectly curated. I stood by the window and watched the last of the police cars pull away from the curb. The afternoon sun was hitting the West 35th Street brownstone at an angle that made the dust motes look like they were performing a choreographed routine. I turned back to the room. Wolfe hadn't moved. He was still anchored in his chair, his eyes closed, his breathing so shallow you might have thought head turned into a very large, very well-dressed statue. On the desk, the small jar of marjoram sat next to his empty beer glass, a tiny green monument to the absurdity of the last 48 hours. "It's over," I said, moving to my desk to start the final billing. "The wine is safe, the ciphers are back in the hands of a man who doesn't deserve them, and the kitchen inventory is officially restored. I assume I can put the marjoram back where it belongs now. Or is it evidence in a federal spice investigation?" Wolfe opened one eye. It was a sharp, calculating amber. "It is contaminated, Archie. Do not be fatuous. A vessel that has held arsenic, even briefly, has no place in a civilized kitchen. Throw it away. Better yet, bury it. The presence of such a vulgarity in this house has been a stain on the week's equilibrium." I picked up the jar. It felt light, nearly weightless, despite the havoc it had caused. Henderson almost had it. If Head just brought his own container, we'd still be looking for a needle in a haystack, literally. He was smart enough to hide the ciphers in a wine crate, but not smart enough to realize that You'd notice a 3-ounce gap on a shelf. Intelligence is not merely the ability to scheme, Archie. It is the ability to respect the environment in which one schemes. Mr. Henderson treated this house as a mere backdrop for his larceny. He failed to account for the fact that in this room, every object has a function, a history, and a designated coordinate. To disturb the order of a man's tools is to announce one's presence with a trumpet blast. He sighed, his massive chest rising and falling. The crime itself was a tedious exercise in greed. The divinyal ciphers are historical curiosities, nothing more. Their value lies in collectors' obsession, not in their intrinsic worth. But the violation of the Montracket, that was the true tragedy. To use a masterpiece of nature as a mere tactical diversion for a theft of paper is the hallmark of a soul that has been withered by the pursuit of profit. "Well, Vaudois is happy," I noted, tapping my pen against my chin. "He's still the king of the cellar, and Sterling even promised him a bonus for loyalty. I didn't have the heart to tell him the bonus was actually a bribe to keep him from talking to the newspapers. Human folly is a renewable resource, Archie. We shall never be out of work as long as men value the appearance of prestige over the reality of integrity." Wolfe pressed a button on his desk, the signal for Fritz to prepare the evening's festivities. "Is the duck nearly ready?" Fritz says 20 minutes. No marjoram, obviously. He's using thyme and a hint of orange zest. Wolfe grunted, a sound of tentative approval. He began the laborious process of hoisting himself out of his chair, a feat of engineering that always made me wonder if the floor joists were reinforced with titanium. Once upright, he smoothed his waistcoat and looked at the office one last time before heading toward the dining room. 48 hours of agitation, Wolfe murmured, for a bottle of fermented juice and a handful of old letters. "We are absurd creatures, Archie." "Speak for yourself," I said, following him toward the smell of roasting duck. "I am just the guy who does the legwork. You're the one who turned a missing herb jar into an international incident. But if you're looking for a quip to end the day, try this. At least we didn't have to drink the evidence. I hear arsenic has a very poor finish." Wolfe didn't laugh. He didn't even smile, but as he reached the doorway, he paused. "The finish is irrelevant, Archie. It's the lack of respect for the vintage that is unforgivable." He stepped into the hallway, his mind already dismissed from the case and fully focused on the orange zest. I stayed behind for a second to turn off the lights, leaving the office to the shadows and the ghosts of dead secrets. It was just another Wednesday in Brownstone. I followed the boss. I was hungry, and in this house, justice is always served after dinner.